I'm a diamond in the rough, a shining piece of coal, trying to reach my goal. My power of speech unimpeachable. Only 19, but my mind is older. These New York City streets get cold.
My name's Franki. I'm in my third year of an arts law degree, majoring in philosophy, majoring less in law. What was the final part of that question?
Yeah, political
My
affiliation.
political affiliation. I don't have one in terms of university politics. I would describe myself as an independent and broadly progressive or left-wing, depending on which of those terms you prefer.
What about outside of university politics? Do you have an affiliation there?
Not officially. I voted for the Labour Party in the last state election. I have yet to vote in a federal election. I'm very excited for July.
So can you tell us why you're running for board? And please don't say because you love the union.
So I think perhaps the more nuanced response is I've been involved in the union for a long time. So it probably started off much the way most students do. Came to university, joined clubs and societies at O Week, got involved in debating, had my first chicken burger at Manning. Time progressed, I had the opportunity to join some of those executives. I joined the debates committee, started eating a lot more chicken burgers at Manning. And those things kind of taught me a lot more about how the union runs and how it operates, but also the ways it could be improved. So things like battling with the Orion portal as a Shades exec, but also seeing like the trouble with library bookings during SUL's mooting competitions. Those things show me how the union can be better, and I would like to change it so I can enjoy my experience and help other students enjoy their experience as well.
What about, speaking of specific controversy recently in the union, would you have voted to deregister the Evangelical Union?
I think the union made a good policy choice because, first and foremost, the union should be responsive to its members' wishes. This policy, in terms of allowing faith-based membership, was very, very important to a particular set of the members, and the union has a responsibility to respond to that. I think it's also important to note that the faith-based membership requirement isn't something that really has a likelihood to have an impact on anyone outside religious societies. So I think insofar as it has an effect, it is only a good effect for people who care about it. There shouldn't really be any harm to other members of the union. So,
Do you think the way that the union originally handled the Evangelical Union decision was the right way to go about it? That is, speaking loudly to Oni, almost deriding the EU?
I think that it is the prerogative of the union to always interact with its members in a respectful way, and I think that the response of the union definitely developed into more of that polite conversation than the initial kind of declamatory statements, but I think that was mostly on both sides and wasn't necessarily a tone set exclusively by the union.
Do you think that the board should be able to discuss issues such as executive salaries in camera?
I think that numbers about how much CEOs are paid and how much Andrew Woodward is paid are very important for students to know. I think day to day, lots of financial issues probably need to be discussed in camera for pragmatic reasons, but that's not to say that issues of financials which are in the student interest to know shouldn't be disclosed at some point, like preferably in a timely manner.
Who would you rank 1 to 3 on the ballot for existing candidates who you're also running with in the election?
So my top 3 picks.
Yeah, that's a much easier way of putting it.
Cool. So I think the 2 people I know I would love to see on board are Courtney and Koko. The reasons for that are I think Koko comes from a group of students who haven't been represented on board since 2011 when Mina Nada was on, and I think it's really important that international students are represented on board so that the board doesn't ignore them or makes sensitive and relevant policies. I also think Courtney is like a very invested woman, and I think she's done a lot of great things with the union, with the university, over our time at university together, and I've had the chance to work with her, and I think she'd be great there. I think, excluding myself from the top 3, I would also like to prop Cameron Hawkins, because I think he has a whole lot of experience in CNS. He's been on more executives than I can name or count, and I think he's done a great job at that, and I think he also brings like a bit more of a science background to the union, which is unusual.
Excellent. Okay, so considering that you just said those 3 candidates, would you be directing your preferences to them on your ballot?
So I think at this stage of the election, campaigning literally started 12 hours ago. It's pretty hard to judge where those preferences would go. I would definitely like to discuss preference deals with those candidates, but obviously that's not a unilateral decision.
Yeah, absolutely. So in saying that you're not particularly sure about this kind of things, does that mean that there's any political machinations kind of going on in the background? Like, is there anything that you would discuss other than the quality of the answers that you just gave us?
So first thing is I would definitely like to discuss my own preference deals, because I don't want it to be some like backdoors political thing that I send some misc hack in to do for me. I think it's important that I discuss those preference deals with the candidates themselves. There isn't any kind of political machinations to my knowledge. Like I'm not a member of a caucus. I'm not bound to any particular preference deals. I'll put them where I think the candidates are most competent.
Who would you rank last in your preferences?
Don Bonder and I probably don't see eye to eye. I've had a brief look at his policy statement, but I also know he's being run by the Liberal Club, who doesn't believe in things like compulsory student unionism, and I think some of his policies just conflict directly with mine and are not really how I see the union going and how it should go.
So who do you think has been the most effective board member who was elected last year?
It's a really interesting question. Just taking a minute to think, because that is actually an important answer. I think it is difficult for me to judge that objectively, but I have had a lot of contact with Shannon on the CNS committee, and I think she's done good work in terms of not necessarily the specific policies that have been put through, but dealing with those policies retroactively, like the forum that was held about the 10 free events, I thought was well handled, and I thought Shannon's done a great job on the CNS committee. More broadly than that, from my understanding of like discussions of issues in board meetings, I think Mikey is great. That may be my personal affection for him as a speaker and as my affiliation with his views coming through, but I think he has also done like a very, very good job and has been quite an effective director rather.
If those people were both running for president, which of them would you vote for?
I think I would vote for Michael. The reason for that is my experience with Shannon has largely been exclusive to CNS, and that is where I've had exposure to the fact that she's been quite effective. But I know that Michael and I hold broadly similar views beyond that. That is not to say we don't often disagree, but I think the way he approaches discussions on board and the way he approaches those decisions is very useful, and I think being an independent is also a mark in his favour.
So is that necessarily, do you think, related to him helping you in your campaign?
I think that the reason he's helping me in my campaign is the same reason I would want to vote for him for president, which is we broadly see eye to eye. We're kind of friends. Like most people do have their friends involved in their campaigns. Mine just happened to be a board director. I don't think if Mikey had said he couldn't be involved in my campaign for some reason, or indeed, last year when board directors couldn't be directly involved in campaigns, that would have prevented me from voting for him, because I still think he's competent outside the fact that he's giving me some advice.
What do you think over the past year has been the best policy developed by the board?
So, tangentially, it's a policy from Debates Committee, and I think it's quite important, and one that I've had a hand in helping design and advocate for is a policy for students who haven't attended private schools, or a list of common private schools who do debating. It's basically an AA quota for students who come from schools that don't have the typical debating background. It's currently looking to be expanded to non-comprehensive public school students exclusively, and the reason for that is the USU has only sent one student from a comprehensive public school to a representative tournament in the last 10 years, and that's something that the Debates Committee is working to rectify, and I think that's a really important policy coming out of the union at the moment.
Do you think that's a problem more broadly in clubs and societies and the people who run them and have power? I don't expect you to know the school makeup of every club and society.
I think it hasn't been my experience of clubs and societies. I think there may be systemic reasons that would be true. For example, coming from a more privileged background would allow you to spend more time on campus and less time working, or living close to campus may assist you in those ways, and I think that's something that the union should try and balance wherever it can, so by providing budget meal options for students and by making sure that societies are accessible to as many people as they can be. But I think to some extent those problems are pretty structural and difficult to overcome as well.
Would you agree that current board members should be able to assist board candidates' campaign, like we were speaking about earlier?
Yeah, I think they should, because I think much like any other student, a board director has a right and almost a responsibility to direct their vote and their experience to a candidate they think will be good at the job. I think on a basic level just as a voter, but also that kind of continuity in a board I think is quite useful. And I know that's the way corporate boards operate, and while the USU isn't like that, I think having some kind of institutional passing down of knowledge is broadly quite useful.
So you said that continuity is important in the board. What about the converse of that? So in boards of recent past, continuity has led to there being social cliques, not just based on political distinctions, so those have played a part of them, but also on the basis of friendship groups on the board. Do you think that can pose issues where perhaps destroying any benefit of continuity?
I think insofar as board members work together for a whole lot of hours and a lot of very important issues, they're always going to develop some form of relationship, and I think it is always better that relationship be a positive one than a negative one, because boards can become quite dysfunctional when there's a lot of resentment between them. So I think that's the trade-off there. But also I think, pointing to the example of like Liv and Mikey, they were obviously friends before getting onto board, and I think my relationship with Mikey is quite similar, but that doesn't mean they haven't disagreed with each other. I think to the extent that there is continuity between board members and generations of them, that continuity is in knowledge and an approach to the board, but not necessarily in opinion.
Would you breach your fiduciary duties as a director if you believed it was in the interests of students?
So I think the first thing is I would try and do everything I could to make sure that I didn't have to breach those duties. So I think it is important that the union discloses as much information as it can to students, and the issue that Rowie was dealing with obviously was very important. And I think the first thing I would have done in that situation was try and convince the board to release that information. But if I was convinced that it was so far in student interests that it had to be released, I think that a board director's duty should come to students in that instance rather.
So are you saying that you would, if push came to shove, would you breach your fiduciary duties in the interests of students?
If the matter was serious enough, yes.
Cool. Okay. And just to follow up on that, can you say exactly which fiduciary duties it would be that you would break?
So I suppose the specific one would be proper use of information. That's the specific fiduciary duty it would apply to.
So I don't think that is necessarily a fiduciary duty.
Sorry? Yes.
No, that's okay. It's just, can you give us an outline maybe of your knowledge of what exactly the fiduciary duties are?
Sure. So the fiduciary duties that apply to directors of any board are good faith with regard to acting in the best interest that a reasonable person could be expected to exercise. It's diligence in that position. It's proper use of information and proper use of that position, to my understanding.
Your policy regarding Guzman and Messina on campus, or better food on campus in a more general sense.
Yep.
Why have you focused that policy, or part of that policy at least, on brands like Guzman and Messina, rather than investing on more union food outlets? I mean, every year I've been at university, people have promised Donut King or McDonald's, and none of those things happen. So why not? Why not just invest in more union food?
Cool. So I think the first thing to note is the union currently doesn't run all of its outlets, and it does put out lots of its spaces to tender. I think it's also unfeasible for the union to be able to run all of those outlets, and particularly because it's continuing to expand. The thrust of that policy is, if the union is opening more spaces and putting some of those food spaces out to tender, students should have a say in what restaurants occupy those spaces. So this isn't a guarantee for Guzman or Messina. This is the proposition that in the event that new spaces open, which is looking pretty likely with the redoing of Wentworth and Manning in the future, that students should have the opportunity to vote on a poll to consider what options they would like the USU to pursue in filling that tender.
Cool. And considering that the renegotiation of the occupancy license is up for next year, 2017,
Yep.
How do you think that kind of particular policy will fit in with the renegotiation, and what part would you take in negotiating it?
So I think the first thing is, as part of the university's strategic plan, they're planning to redo Wentworth and Manning, to my understanding. I think, therefore, the discussion about who will occupy those spaces needs to happen sooner rather than later, which is why I think this policy is quite relevant. In terms of a space that I would personally have in that negotiation, I can't quite say. I imagine we'd probably go to a working party who would approach that more directly. I would like to be a part of that working party because it's a policy I care a lot about, but I would mostly like to just see it happen.
The question I have, and this is one I have a lot of people, and a lot of the things the union does, is if I'm the university, why would I not just give the space to Guzman and get the money myself, rather than giving space to the union that I know will inevitably be given to a third party making profit for the union?
So I think to some extent the university could operate under that mindset with almost any policy to do with the union, like could just kick it out entirely and try and do everything themselves. I think the university and the union have reached a truce recently, and the reasoning for that is because the university recognises to some extent the union provides really useful resources for students. And I think it is in the university's best interest to give some autonomy to the union in terms of being able to fund and run things for itself, so it's not just feeding off the university's pocket.
Do you think there's a point in, say, mismanagement in the union where the university should step in? So if something was going wrong in the union, do you think the university has a responsibility, ignoring the actual legal ability they have to do it? If the university could, is there a point at which they should step into the union's affairs?
I think the union should operate autonomously to the university. The reason for that is the union has primarily student interests at its heart, and I don't think the university does. So I think that in the event that something is going wrong with the union, the university stepping in would not be ideal. So we can look at examples of other universities where post-voluntary student unionism, the unions have sort of flailed a bit and universities have stepped in, and there's now some kind of amorphous union-university mix that doesn't, I don't think, work as well as the USU does, and I'd like to preserve that structure.
You say that we should have things like Guzman and Messina, which are great, and you also say that we should have budget food outlets.
Yep.
I don't know how you have both of those things. How do you?
So I think it is pretty easy to mandate that those outlets have budget options. I think those look like slightly less complex meals or like smaller servings of Messina, like a kid's cup. I don't think that's particularly hard to mandate, particularly because I imagine these tenancies will probably be pretty competitive. You're guaranteed students who will always be hungry and who will always want food. Like there's a pretty constant stream of people throughout the course of the year. So I don't think it is a particularly difficult condition for the union to impose that there must be a budget option offered. In fact, it already does mandate an access discount for all of its outlets.
What about then the union's own prices? They just rose everything by inflation, picking several years of inflationary growth into 1 year. That's what they've done.
Yeah.
Was that appropriate of the union to do?
I think obviously the union needs to remain solvent, and it's important that it doesn't operate at a loss. I think it was probably prudent of them to adjust their costs for inflation to the extent that they probably should have done that more incrementally and sooner. That's something they can't really correct for in hindsight, but probably they should consider going forward.
Mm-hmm. And the final question on this is, do you think that's actually what they did? Because it cost me more to buy a coffee at a union outlet than it does to get a campus coffee, which is better coffee at Taste.
If there is cheaper, better coffee, then the union definitely needs to investigate that, because I think it's in the union's best interest not to raise money off students, but to get funding in the most efficient way that they can to make sure they are operating the best outlets that they can for students and the best services they can for students. I don't think coffee should be expensive. I will die in this election if it is.
Okay. So you mentioned your policy statement that you plan to redo Manning to turn to a real late night hotspot.
Yep.
Could you maybe elaborate on this point, and how would you expect to do that?
Yeah, totally.
Kind of lay out your plan.
So, to my understanding, it's already in the works that Manning is sort of being considered to have a bit of a revamp, and I think that's quite important because it has the potential to be a very good venue, but it is critically underattended. So I've been to a couple of the Manning parties this year that have been advertised, and a little bit, and they've just been empty. The dance floors have been empty. Shades co-hosted a party, and Shades party is usually raging, and even then we couldn't fill the numbers that we usually would at a party. I think that's something that it is a waste of union resources, because we could be doing so much more with that space. In terms of how that would operate, I think the layout of the top floor of Manning is a bit odd. It probably doesn't make the best use of space. I'd like to see the bar a bit more central, perhaps opening outside. I think there are lots of ways to make that space more accessible and more inviting as a venue that aren't particularly difficult.
So how would you go about doing that necessarily? So how would you use the union's budget or cooperate with either board members in order to actually turn that kind of plan into reality?
Cool. So I think I've mentioned that the redoing of Manning is on like the university strategic plan. So it's already going to be redone to some extent. That's in the works. I'm not quite sure how it's currently operating at the union level and what they're considering. I imagine there's probably some kind of working group because it would be, I imagine, a very big project to work on. I would love to be a part of that and to have input into how that space is designed, and I think that's the first step. After it's designed, I think having a process of like feedback and renewal from students and other board directors, obviously, and other members of the staff would be useful, and coming to a design that could eventually be proposed and ratified by the board and proceed with building. I think that's how it would work.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. So we previously spoke about the USU already developing an app, having that in the pipeline. Do you personally know anything about app development, or in another area, why would having you on board make a difference to having this application?
Cool. So I interned at Google over the summer, and I think that gave me a lot of diverse opportunities to learn a lot about how apps are built, and particularly the user-facing experience of those apps. So I think the way I could have input is making sure the app is the best it can possibly be and as relevant to students as possible. So things like aggregating all the information across the USU's 4 sources of information in one place, and letting students know the events that are happening right now around them. Like there's a veggie sock lunch on East Nav in 10 minutes, or a killer stand-up set in a cellar in half an hour. Those kind of things I think are what the app really needs.
Okay, so in terms of other candidates that are running at the moment, what is your opinion of Koko's policy of having a USU portfolio for international students?
I think that's broadly consistent with some of the policies that I've proposed. I think that generally speaking, the USU portfolios are directed towards particular social groups, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's definitely consistent with the USU's ideals to have international student portfolio. One of my policies, in fact, is setting aside a dedicated position on the CNS committee for an international student, and I think that probably along the same vein, same thinking.
Yeah, excellent. And so also stemming from that, establishing AA for individual clubs and societies, that's also something you would agree with?
I think that is not something I've considered to the same extent. AA for individual clubs and societies seems less useful perhaps than having maybe a mandated position like an international students officer for bigger executives or for faculty clubs and societies. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And okay, so you mentioned your policies, an internship database.
Yeah.
How exactly would this be different or better than the careers hub that the university has already established?
Cool. So I think the difference is the union has the capacity to really invest in its students in the way that university doesn't. Because when the university runs a careers fair, they're paying an HR director from some law firm to turn up and hand out flyers. But when the union runs a careers fair, they're getting the invested, dedicated alumni who attended the university and were members of the union to come back, and they might be, a managing partner of that law firm and be able to not only provide opportunities for internships but also networking opportunities, and I think it just has additional usefulness to what the Careers Hub has to offer.
Excellent. So what exactly is your position on unpaid internships in the university?
I think unpaid internships should be avoided where possible. I think that internship culture is quite exclusionary. I understand that there is some justification that it may be necessary to help you get a job in the future, but I think that just excludes students who can't afford to work all summer for free.
Okay, absolutely. So stemming from that, is that also your position on the V team, which is a voluntary unpaid position?
Definitely. So I think that the V team members should never replace students who would otherwise be paid for that work. And I think that the union is in fact moving in the direction of paying students. So we now have paid event coordinators, we have Eden Casita, Michael Sun, etc., who have replaced people who would otherwise be VT members. And I think that's a good trend. I think that there is some really useful places for actual volunteering. So things like the school tutoring program, which I was a part of last year, which is outreach based. I think that's the real place for the VT to make a difference.
Fantastic. So do you have any issues with the V team as it is, and how do you think that would sit necessarily with what I would assume would be a progressive set of ideals with labour rights, worker base, kind of thing like that? Does that still sit comfortably with you?
I think that it is definitely, there are definitely opportunities for volunteering on campus that should remain volunteering opportunities. That said, I think there may be an unhealthy trend in increasing number of VT members in the past few years at the exclusion perhaps of paid positions, or maybe in the event that there are VT members, the best way to incentivise those members or give them something back would be, you know, a free lunch on the day, or in the event that it's running an event or a festival, maybe giving them some ownership and oversight of that project so it becomes something they can, you know, put on their CV or point to as something they achieved, rather than just an amorphous, unpaid member of a team.
Excellent. And one last and final question. Can you name a policy of yours that you believe truly sets you apart from the other candidates?
I have to think about that one because I have to think of all the other candidates' policies.
Of course, that's fine. You can take your time.
I think one thing that sets me aside is the way I would approach board consultation with students. So one of my policies is embracing a better board, and what I've called student issues councils. So recently we saw the 10 free event max scrapped, and I think that was something the USU was right to scrap, but I think it also should never have been a policy that was made in the first place. So my idea with student issues councils is when the board considers that type of policy that would drastically change the way CNS operates, it is their mandate to set up issues council of students who would be affected by that policy. So in this instance might have been exec members of SUTEC and SUDS, to discuss that policy with them so that the board doesn't have to preemptively undo months of bad policy.
Very much, Grace Frank.
Now a diamond in the rough, a shining piece of coal, trying to reach my goal. My power of speech unimpeachable. Only 19, but my mind is older. These New York City streets get cold. I show